They said she had everything. A husband whose name alone opened doors in the highest places, a mansion so vast it felt like a kingdom of glass and gold, closets lined with jewels, dinners with presidents, charity galas where her smile was plastered across magazines. But that night, under a storm that drowned the city in endless rain, her life cracked open in a way no diamond could ever hide. It began with the sound of a child crying, not in a nursery, not in the safety of warm sheets, but in the cold, merciless downpour of a deserted street. She lowered the tinted window of her car, and through the blur of the rain she saw him, a man, kneeling, soaked to the bone, shaking. In his trembling arms, 2 babies, twins, their tiny bodies pressed against his chest, their cries swallowed by thunder. For a moment, she froze. The world of marble floors and crystal chandeliers felt galaxies away. Who was this man? Why was he here, in the rain, begging, holding children who should have been sleeping in safety? But it wasn't just pity that held her. It was recognition. Something in his eyes, something in the way his lips quivered when he looked up at her car. Her heart clenched. She had seen that face before, long ago, in a life she was told to forget, in a promise buried beneath wealth, contracts and silence, and as lightning lit the street, her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a stranger. This was a ghost from her past. A ghost carrying 2 crying children, and a truth she was never meant to uncover. She did not move. She did not speak. Her hand clutched the door handle inside the car, frozen as if the storm outside had turned her veins into ice. The chauffeur waited for her command, but none came. Instead, she stared at the man, the twins, the trembling figure in the rain. The world around her blurred, the neon lights of the city smudged into streaks of color against the glass. Yet that single image, the man, the babies, the desperation, burned sharper than anything she had seen in years. Because in his face, she saw the past she had buried. Not the glamorous dinners, not the gold rings or the flawless pearls, but the boy she once knew. The boy who once held her hand beneath the shade of a broken tree, whispering dreams too fragile to last. She thought he had vanished from the world, consumed by the silence of time. Yet here he was, not as the man of her dreams, but as a beggar at her window. She forced herself to breathe. The storm pressed harder, each drop like a hammer on the car roof, drumming the rhythm of fate. She blinked, and in that blink, questions tore at her mind. Why was he here? Where was their mother? Why twin babies, so young, so vulnerable, cradled in his weak arms as though life itself was slipping from them? Her lips parted, but no sound escaped. For the first time in years, Isabella, the woman the world envied, felt powerless. Not in the face of wealth, not in the face of power, but in the face of truth. Her husband's face flashed in her memory. Victor, cold eyes, sharp jaw, a man worshipped in the press but feared in silence. A man who built empires on control. A man who demanded her silence in exchange for stability. And now, as she stared at the beggar, she realized something terrifying. This was no chance encounter. This was no random plea for help. This moment was meant for her. The rain thickened. Thunder broke again, splitting the sky with merciless rage. And in that thunder, she heard more than sound. She heard a warning, a prophecy, a call she could not ignore. Her heart raced. The chauffeur finally asked, "Madam, should I drive?" But her silence was louder than words, because deep down she knew, if she left now, if she closed her eyes to this moment, she would never forgive herself. And so she stayed, watched, waited. As the man lifted his face to the car window, water streaming down his scarred skin, lips trembling as though begging without voice, the babies whimpered, the sound cut through her chest like broken glass. And then it happened. The recognition in his eyes, the silent connection, The truth neither had spoken yet, but both felt like a storm ripping through their veins. This was not just a man. This was her past, clawing its way back into her present. And as her chest heaved with the weight of realization, one truth echoed louder than thunder. Her life of diamonds and pearls was about to shatter. The car idled at the curb, its engine humming like a heartbeat trying to drown out the storm. Inside, Isabella's world tilted between two realities, the one polished by money and the one now smeared in rain and sorrow before her eyes. She should have ordered the driver to leave. That is what was expected of her. That is what Victor would demand. A billionaire's wife was not meant to lower herself to the cries of a beggar. Her world was gala halls, not drenched sidewalks. Her place was at Victor's side, not staring at a man who looked as though life itself had chewed him up and spat him out. And yet, she could not look away, because in that rain-soaked figure there was something more than misery. There was memory, a shadow of a life she had once touched but was forced to abandon, and in the delicate faces of the twins pressed against his chest, she saw innocence, unguarded, undeserving of this fate. The driver cleared his throat. He had served her for years, but tonight his voice was edged with unease. "Madam, the rain is heavy. We should go." She did not answer. Her mind drifted to the lavish dining hall waiting back home, to Victor's impatient glare, to the carefully curated schedule she was meant to follow. And then, just as quickly, her thoughts snapped back to the street, to him, to those babies, to the past clawing through the storm. 1,000 questions stabbed at her chest. Why was he here? Why had he vanished all those years ago, only to reappear in this wretched form? And why, of all places, did fate place him on her path tonight? The city lights flickered against the raindrops, painting broken reflections across the windshield. They looked like shards of glass, fragile, sharp, unsteady. And somewhere deep inside, Isabella knew, her own reflection was about to break just the same, because wealth had never silenced the truth. Money had buried it, yes, but tonight, in the eyes of a beggar, it had returned. The storm outside raged, but the storm inside her was louder. She remembered the letters, the ones she once hid beneath her pillow as a girl, written in clumsy handwriting, promising forever. She remembered the laughter, the stolen walks, the dreams they built on nothing but hope. And she remembered the night he was taken from her, when her life was sold into another man's world, sealed with contracts and rings she never chose. She thought he was gone forever, but here he was, and he was not alone. Those twins were more than children in the rain. They were keys, keys to a truth she had not yet dared to speak, even to herself. Her hand trembled against the leather seat. For the first time in years, Isabella felt human again, stripped of the cold armor of luxury, stripped of Victor's shadow, left bare before the weight of the past. And as thunder shook the sky once more, her decision crystallized. She would not leave. Not tonight. Not without knowing who those children were, and not without learning what had broken the man she once loved into the beggar kneeling before her. The world only ever saw the surface, the flawless gowns, stitched with diamonds, the golden chandeliers that bathed her skin in light, the carefully staged photographs on magazine covers, where her smile was wide enough to convince even herself. She was Isabella Victoriano, wife to a man whose empire reached across oceans, whose name was printed on glass towers that scraped the sky. Wherever she walked, whispers followed. They called her blessed. They called her untouchable. They called her the woman who had it all. But no one ever asked if she was happy. No one ever wondered what it meant to be a jewel locked in a vault, admired but never free. Every morning began with the same script. The maids entered silently, setting her gowns for the day. The chef arranged breakfast so precise it looked more like an exhibit than a meal. The chauffeur pulled the car to the marble steps of the mansion while security men scanned the gates. And then there was Victor, her husband. a man who did not need to raise his voice to command obedience. His presence alone carried weight, the kind that suffocated more than it comforted. He kissed her hand before Gallus, posed with her in photographs, whispered to her in front of investors. But behind the closed doors of their towering estate, his silence cut deeper than any wound. He was a man who lived for power, for image, for control, and Isabella was his most precious possession. The world never saw the tremor in her hands when the cameras stopped flashing. They never saw the loneliness hidden behind jeweled eyes. They never heard the silence of nights, where the mansion echoed not with laughter, but with the hum of machines keeping his empire alive. Her friends envied her, her enemies resented her, but no one truly knew her, not anymore, until tonight. Because the sight of that man in the storm had pierced the mask she wore so carefully, the mask that told the world she was whole when inside she was fragments of someone she used to be. And though the world believed her life was built on perfection, Isabella knew that perfection was a cage. And now, standing just beyond its bars, was the one person who could unlock it. The storm outside was not just rain, it was memory returning. It was truth refusing to stay buried. For years, she had convinced herself she was untouchable, that the past had been erased by the sheer weight of Victor's wealth, that the boy she once knew was gone, replaced by this life of glass and gold. But as the thunder rolled, she realized something chilling. The past was not gone. It was waiting. And tonight, it had found her. The illusion she had lived in for so long was cracking, and soon the world would see what she had hidden behind diamonds and silk. The storm that shattered her illusions did not come without warning. The night before, there had already been signs, subtle, fragile threads pulling loose at the seams of her carefully woven life. She had returned home late, her heels clicking against the marble floor of the mansion, echoing through rooms so vast they felt like caverns. The chandeliers glistened, the paintings watched silently, but the house, her supposed home, felt colder than the rain outside. Victor was in his study, as he often was, his face lit by the pale glow of a dozen screens. Numbers, charts, messages, all demanding his attention. She had grown used to being invisible in those moments, a shadow slipping past his empire of blinking lights and endless calls. But on that night something different happened. A letter waited for her. Not on fine stationery, not embossed with seals of wealth, but a crumpled envelope left discreetly on her vanity table. No handwriting on the front, no signature, just her name, written in haste. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, a single sheet, its edges damp as though touched by rain, and on it, only a few words. The past is not gone. Look outside the glass walls you live in. Tomorrow it will return. No explanation, no sender, only a warning. Isabella's heart had quickened. She locked the letter away in her drawer, hiding it as though Victor's eyes could pierce through walls. She told herself it was nonsense, a trick, a threat, perhaps one of the many faceless enemies Victor had made over the years. But she felt it, that stirring in her chest. That shadow whispering her life was not as secure as she had been told. Later that night, she lay awake in the silence of her silk-covered bed, her mind replaying the words again and again. The mansion felt less like a fortress, more like a cage. The ticking clock by her side grew louder, each second dragging her closer to a truth she could neither name nor escape. And then, as the rain began to fall outside, she remembered something she had not thought of in years, a promise once made under the shade of a broken tree. A boy's voice, steady and certain, whispering, "I will find you, no matter where life takes us." She turned restlessly beneath the sheets, telling herself it was a dream, a fragment of memory stirred by loneliness. But deep down, she knew better. The past had sent her a message, and by the time the storm reached its peak the following night, she would learn just how much of her life had been built on lies. Morning broke with gold spilling across the mansion's tall windows, but inside, the air was heavy, unshaken by the rising sun. The staff moved briskly, their footsteps muted against polished floors. The chefs prepared dishes that looked more like paintings than meals. Florists replaced blooms that had wilted overnight, as though even flowers were forbidden from showing imperfection in Victor's house. For the world, this was another day in the life of Isabella Victoriano, billionaire's wife, polished icon, admired by strangers who whispered her name with envy. Invitations had been sent, photographers were waiting, a charity luncheon was to be held where her presence would dazzle like always. But for Isabella, the morning was a mask she could no longer wear without effort. She sat before her mirror, jewels spread across the vanity, hair arranged perfectly by the steady hands of a stylist. And yet, her eyes betrayed her. They were restless, shadowed by the memory of the letter hidden in her drawer, and the echo of the storm from the night before. Her hands hovered over the pearls Victor had gifted her. She remembered the moment he clasped them around her neck, the cameras flashing, the applause ringing. Yet those pearls felt colder than the rain she had seen soak the beggar the night before. They felt heavy, like chains disguised as beauty. When she descended the staircase, Victor was waiting. Immaculate in his suit, sharp as steel, a man who seemed untouched by the world's chaos. He kissed her hand mechanically, like an obligation performed for an audience, even when no one was watching. "Ready?" he asked, his voice flat, his gaze fixed already on the day ahead, the contracts, the speeches, the stage. She smiled, but the smile did not reach her eyes, because in her mind she saw again the rain-soaked figure, the trembling arms clutching two fragile children, the scar on his face that told her what her heart had already whispered. The beggar was not a stranger. The convoy of cars left the mansion, tires rolling across the gravel like drums of ceremony. Security men followed, sharp eyes scanning for threats that could come from anywhere but the one place that mattered, the past. At the luncheon, applause greeted her, flashes of cameras captured her elegance. She played her part, her voice smooth, her posture flawless. Guests admired her, journalists scribbled praises, and Victor basked in the glow of his empire. But behind her calm expression, Isabella's heart pounded with secrets. She remembered the words, "Tomorrow it will return." And she knew the storm had not passed. It was waiting for the moment when her perfect world would no longer hold. And as she raised her glass for the toast, her eyes flicked to the tall windows of the hall. Outside, dark clouds were already gathering. The storm had returned. The hall shimmered beneath chandeliers, their crystals scattering light like fragments of captured stars. Guests filled the long tables, their laughter rising in gentle waves, their conversations punctuated by the soft clink of silver against porcelain. Photographers hovered at the edges, capturing every smile, every gesture, every illusion of perfection. And there she was, Isabella Victoriano, seated at the center of it all, the woman whose life seemed painted in gold. Her gown gleamed, her jewels glistened, her posture flawless. To the world, she was untouchable. To the cameras, she was radiant. To Victor, she was decoration, the crown jewel of his empire. But within her, the storm raged. Each laugh she offered to the guests felt like a mask slipping further from her face. Each sip from her crystal glass felt bitter on her tongue. And every flicker of thunder outside, muffled by the tall windows, reminded her of what waited beyond the glass walls of the hall. Then, it happened. The doors. They creaked open with a sound that silenced laughter, a sound out of place amid the music and applause. Heads turned, cameras shifted, whispers began to spread. And through the doorway he appeared, soaked, trembling, his clothes clinging to his broken frame. His arms cradled the twins, their cries echoing into the hall like a chorus of accusation. Each wail cut through the string music. Each sob dragged eyes from the glittering tables to the figure who did not belong in this world of wealth. Gasps spread across the room. Some guests raised hands to their mouths. Others turned to Victor, awaiting his reaction. Security men stirred uneasily, waiting for his command. But Isabella... She froze. Her heart slammed against her chest, harder with every step the man took into the hall. His eyes searched the crowd, desperate, furious, broken. And when they found hers, the world around her collapsed. She knew him, not as the beggar they saw now, not as the intruder they whispered about, but as the boy who once held her hand, the boy who once promised her a future untouched by gold and glass. He staggered forward, his voice hoarse, cracked by the storm and the years between them. Though his words were weak, they carried enough power to silence the entire hall. And as he spoke, every jewel on Isabella's neck felt heavier. Every diamond on her hand burned against her skin. The illusion had been shattered. The storm outside had broken through the walls of glass. And the truth, carried in the arms of a desperate man, now stood in the very heart of her perfect world. The guests did not know what they were witnessing, but Isabella did. She knew that life as she had known it would never return. The hall was no longer filled with laughter. It was a chamber of whispers, sharp intakes of breath, and the restless shifting of silks against velvet seats. The music faltered, the violin's bows trembling in the players' hands, waiting for direction that never came. Victor's eyes blazed with fury as he rose from his seat, his jaw tightening with every step. His empire had been built on control, and yet here was chaos, dripping, crying, stumbling through the very heart of his kingdom. With a snap of his fingers, the security men surged forward. Their dark suits formed a wall, their hands already reaching. Guests leaned forward, hungry for scandal, yet fearful of what it meant. But Isabella moved first. Her chair scraped across the marble, its sound cutting through the tension like a blade. She stood, her gown trailing behind her, her face pale yet unyielding. The world seemed to expect her to recoil, to step back into the safety of her husband's shadow. But she did not. She walked toward the man. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eyes widened. Victor's fury burned hotter. And before the security men could seize him, Isabella lifted a trembling hand. Her voice, though soft, carried with it an authority none could deny. Not here. Not now. The hall fell into silence. The command was not Victor's, but hers. And for the first time, the room obeyed her. With careful steps, she approached the drenched figure. The twins whimpered in his arms, their cries softer now, as if they too sensed the weight of this moment. His eyes met hers, pleading, broken, but still holding the echo of a bond that time and power had not erased. She turned to the guards. "Bring him," she whispered. Then, after a pause, her voice sharpened. Gently. The guests murmured, scandal swelling in their throats. Victor's glare could have turned stone to ash, yet he said nothing. He could not before the eyes of the elite who watched him, measured him, waited to see if his world was truly as unshakable as he claimed. Through the back corridors they moved, away from the chandeliers, away from the cameras, away from the carefully constructed world of Victoriano perfection. Their footsteps echoed against the cold marble floors, the storm outside beating harder against the tall glass windows. At last they entered a private chamber, a small, dimly lit room lined with bookshelves and heavy curtains that muffled the sounds of thunder. Here the walls did not shine. Here no applause would mask the truth. The door closed behind them. Silence. The man sank into a chair, his arms tightening protectively around the twins. His breath came in ragged waves, each exhale dragging the weight of years gone wrong. Isabella stood before him, her hands trembling though she tried to still them against the folds of her gown. And for a long moment neither spoke. But then he broke the silence. His words, hoarse and cracked, cut through the quiet like glass. "You left me, Isabella. You left me with nothing but this storm. And their cries." Her breath caught. Her world tilted. The room itself seemed to lean closer, as if the walls themselves craved the confession that was about to spill. For Isabella knew The questions she had buried, the choices she had made, the truths she had silenced, all of them had returned, and they had returned with witnesses too young to understand, yet too powerful to ignore. The twins shifted in his arms. Their eyes, wide and unknowing, seemed to pierce her mask more deeply than any accusation could. And in that dim chamber, away from Victor's watchful glare, Isabella realized the night was no longer hers to control. It was his, and theirs, and the truth that refused to stay buried. The storm outside clawed at the windows, its voice rising like the judgment of heaven itself. Inside, the chamber's silence was heavy, broken only by the shallow breaths of the children and the faint rustle of silk as Isabella stood frozen. The man's eyes, weary, sunken, but burning with a feverish clarity, did not leave hers. His words came slowly, as though each syllable carried the weight of years left unspoken. You think wealth erased the past? You think a mansion can silence the cries of the forgotten? His voice trembled, not with weakness, but with the fury of a wound that had never healed. Isabella's lips parted, but no answer escaped. And then, his gaze lowered to the twins in his arms. His rough hands, scarred and trembling, brushed their damp curls as though even his rage could not eclipse his tenderness for them. They are all I had left. And do you know why, Isabella? Because you were supposed to be there. Because once, long before Victor's shadow consumed you, you were mine. You were ours. The words fell like stones in still water, sending shockwaves through the chamber. Her fingers gripped the folds of her gown until her knuckles whitened. The room seemed to shrink, pulling her inward, back into years she had sworn never to revisit. And so the past unfolded, not in her voice, but in the spaces between his words. She remembered the streets where lanterns flickered against crumbling walls, where their laughter once echoed in the nights of hunger and hope. She remembered his hands, once strong and calloused, building a future brick by brick, a future that promised survival, even joy, in the face of ruin. But she also remembered the day Victor appeared. His arrival was like the sun piercing through clouds, dazzling, impossible to resist, burning away every shadow that had defined her world. She had chosen the sun, believing it would save her, and in doing so, she left the one who had shared her darkness. Now, standing before him, the cost of that choice returned, embodied in the small frames of the twins who clung to his chest. The man's voice sharpened, dragging her back to the present. Do they know, Isabella? Do they know that the woman who stands in gowns dripping with jewels once walked barefoot in the mud with their father? Do they know that the man they call a beggar was once the man you swore never to abandon? Her heart pounded against her ribs, every beat echoing like a hammer against the walls of her cage. She wanted to speak, to deny, to justify, yet no words came, because beneath his fury, beneath his bitterness, there was truth, and truth once spoken aloud cannot be undone. The twins stirred again, their small eyes turning toward her, searching, questioning, as though even in their innocence they sensed the weight pressing upon the air. And Isabella, for the first time in years, felt the fragile threads of her carefully woven life beginning to fray. The past was no longer past. It had entered the room. It had a face. It had two tiny hands, and it would not leave quietly. The chamber door creaked open, not gently, but with the weight of footsteps that knew no hesitation. Victor stood in the doorway. His presence alone silenced the room. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a coat that shimmered faintly with the storm's rain, he was a man who had learned to bend people with his gaze long before lifting a hand. His eyes swept across the scene, Isabella standing rigid, pale as stone, the man, ragged but unbroken, clutching two children who blinked back at the light with innocent confusion. And then his stare hardened. Isabella. His voice cut through the air like steel. Explain this. The beggar's laugh was hollow, bitter, Explain? She has explained nothing for years. Perhaps now she should explain to you what she took from me. From us. Victor's jaw tightened, his fists clenched. His eyes, dark and unyielding, shifted from Isabella to the twins, and then back again. What are these children doing in my home? His words dripped with disdain, but beneath it simmered a curiosity he could not mask. Who is this man who dares bring his filth under my roof? The man's voice rose, defiant, though his body trembled with exhaustion. You call me filth? Once you were the intruder. Once you stood in the shadows of alleys you'd never walked before, and took what was not yours. You think your money has erased the truth, Victor? You think your gold can rewrite the promises she made? Victor's face darkened. He stepped forward, boots echoing on the marble floor, each sound a warning. I don't tolerate riddles, he spat. Speak plainly, or you and your burdens will be thrown back into the storm where you belong. Isabella flinched. Her silence was no longer possible. The weight of two worlds pressed against her. The world she had chosen, gilded in wealth but built upon compromise, and the world she had abandoned, raw and unforgiving, yet undeniably hers. Her lips parted, trembling. Words lingered on the edge, but before they could form, the man's voice tore through the room. They are her blood, Victor. Look at them. Look closely. You'll see yourself absent. You'll see me alive in them. These children. His voice cracked, then rose again with a fury that shook him. Are Isabella's legacy, the one she buried the day she stepped into your carriage. Victor froze. The storm outside seemed to roar louder, pressing against the windows as though the heavens themselves demanded the truth be heard. His gaze snapped to Isabella. Is it true? The room became a battlefield of silence. The twins fidgeted in the man's arms, unaware of the war their existence had ignited. And Isabella, torn between the life she had embraced and the past that had clawed its way back into her present, felt the walls of her mansion closing in. If she answered, everything would change. If she stayed silent, the storm outside would be nothing compared to the storm inside. For a long moment the mansion seemed to forget it was built of stone and steel. It felt alive, trembling under the weight of words yet unsaid. Victor's demand still hung in the air. Is it true? Isabella's knees weakened. Her throat burned. Every second she delayed only widened the chasm between the three of them. Her heart pounded as though trying to remind her it still belonged to something beyond luxury, beyond Victor's control. She looked at the twins. Their eyes, soft, wide, uncertain, were mirrors of her own youth. The boy's jawline, the girl's delicate brow, echoes she could not deny, not anymore. Her lips trembled as the first word slipped out. Yes. The word was quiet, almost fragile, yet it exploded through the room with the force of a thunderclap. Victor's head tilted, his gaze sharpening like a blade. Yes. What? Her chest heaved. Her eyes glistened with tears she had long buried. She could feel the ground beneath her feet giving way. Yes, they are mine. The beggar's arms tightened around the children. His face broke, not in shock, but in the vindication of a truth long carried alone. Victor's nostrils flared, his voice a low growl. You dare. His words halted, choked by the sheer audacity of what he was hearing. You dare tell me that while I built empires, while I carved a dynasty out of nothing, you— She cut him off, her voice rising in desperation. Do not twist this, Victor. These children were born before your empire touched me, before your shadow consumed my world. They are not shame. They are not mistakes. They are flesh of my flesh, my blood. The man's eyes glistened, years of pain fighting against the storm of anger and hope. You hear her now, Victor. She has spoken, the truth no gold could silence. Victor turned on him with fury. You You dare come here dragging her past through my halls, parading children like proof of some forgotten claim? You think I will allow this stain on my house?" The children flinched at the word stain, their small faces tightening in confusion. Isabella stepped forward, her arms spread wide, shielding them. "Enough!" she cried, her voice shaking yet unyielding. "You call them a stain? Then I am the stain, Victor, for it was I who abandoned them, not him, not them, me." The confession tore from her soul like glass ripping through skin. The room echoed with it. The beggar, their father, dropped his head, the burden of vindication as heavy as the burden of loss. The children, too young to understand the full storm around them, clutched his tattered coat. Victor's face hardened into something unreadable. The man of empire, the king of marble halls, the husband who had believed every thread of her woven life, now stood stripped of certainty. Isabella's tears streamed freely. Her words tumbled on, unstoppable. "I chose wealth over love. I chose comfort over sacrifice. And every night I laid my head on silk pillows, I wondered if they were cold, if they were hungry. I silenced the thought. I let silence eat away at me. And tonight, silence ends." Her chest heaved as if her very soul had been set aflame. The storm outside howled, pressing its voice into the mansion, mingling with the cries of truth that had finally broken free. The silence that followed was heavier than chains. 3 lives, Victor, Isabella, the beggar, now locked in a battle that would decide whether the twins would be claimed, rejected, or torn apart once again. And for the first time in years, Isabella felt something stronger than fear. She felt freedom in the truth. But the cost of truth was only beginning to unfold. The storm outside lashed the glass, lightning igniting the chandeliers with bursts of ghostly light. But it was the storm inside that threatened to tear the walls apart. Victor's jaw clenched as he stared at Isabella. The name of his empire, the respect of his boardrooms, the envy of other men, all now mocked by a truth whispered from the lips of the woman who was meant to be his anchor. He spoke slowly, each syllable like stone grinding against stone. "You mean to tell me, while I gave you everything, you held back this?" Isabella's voice quivered, yet carried resolve. "What you gave me was a kingdom, Victor, but what I buried was my own flesh and blood." The beggar stepped forward. His voice was calm, yet heavy with years of bruised dignity. "She speaks now because you forced silence on her. You caged her in gold. But truth cannot stay caged forever." Victor's glare shifted to him, sharp as a blade. "And you? You come to my house, dressed in rags with children at your heel, and claim authority over my wife, over my name?" The beggar's hand tightened on his cane, though his eyes never wavered. "I claim nothing that isn't mine. I claim the years stolen from my children, the years she wept in secret. I claim justice, not for me, but for them." The twins, sensing the fire between men, pressed closer to their father, their tiny frames dwarfed by the shadows of giants. Victor's laugh broke out, hollow, bitter. "Justice? Do you even know the meaning of that word? Justice is what I deal in contracts, in courts, in boardrooms. Justice is measured in power, and you have none." The beggar lifted his chin. His ragged coat sagged from his shoulders, but in that moment he seemed taller than Victor himself. Power is not justice. A man may own towers and ships and armies, but if he cannot protect the innocent, he owns nothing at all. Victor's nostrils flared. His hand shot forward, pointing at the children. "They are not mine, and they will never be mine. Do you hear me?" The words hit Isabella like a blade to the chest. She stumbled, her breath stolen. The twins froze, too young to fully grasp rejection, but old enough to feel the chill of it seep into their hearts. Their eyes darted to their mother, silently asking if what they had just heard was truth. Isabella fell to her knees, pulling them close, her arms shielding them from words sharper than any whip. "No, don't listen. Don't let his pride define you. You are mine. You are loved. You are not shadows in his house. You are light," Victor's voice thundered. "Light? Do you think love will shield them from what this world does to bastards, from the eyes of society, from the whispers in the halls? My name, my empire, will not be stained." The beggar's voice rose, steady as iron. "And what is your empire worth, Victor, if it cannot stand beside truth? If it fears children?" Silence fell, heavy, suffocating. Isabella's tears soaked the twins' hair. The storm roared. The walls seemed to bend under the weight of clashing worlds. Wealth against poverty, pride against love, silence against truth. And in the middle of it all, two children trembled, unaware that their fate hung by the fragile thread of their mother's voice, their father's endurance, and Victor's pride. The night had reached its breaking point. The question was no longer who held the truth, but who would hold the power to act upon it. Victor's shadow stretched long across the marble floor, lightning flickering behind him, turning his form into that of a Titan, towering, merciless, immovable. His voice, low at first, crawled across the room like a warning. "You have until dawn, Isabella." Her head lifted slowly, eyes swollen with tears, but locked on his in disbelief. "Until dawn? For what?" Victor's gaze cut like steel. "For a choice. Either those children leave this house, or you do." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, holding its breath. The twins clutched tighter to their mother, sensing her trembling, though not yet comprehending the weight of the words. The beggar's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening on the cane until his knuckles turned white. Isabella's voice broke into a cry. "You can't ask me to choose between my blood and your pride. They are my children, Victor. My children." But Victor's face was unyielding. "They are not mine. And no empire, no legacy, can survive such a lie. Do you understand? My name is my empire. My name is my crown. If they stay, everything I built will crumble under shame and whispers. And I will not allow that." The beggar stepped forward, his voice thick with years of pain and anger. "So you would cast out children? Children who never asked to be born into your war of pride and silence? You call yourself a man of power, but you are weak, Victor, weak to the truth, weak to love." Victor turned to him, rage simmering in his eyes. "You dare lecture me in my own house, you, who has nothing, who crawled back here with rags and stories. You call me weak? Look at you. You stand in my hall because she let you in, not because you belong here." The beggar's eyes did not flinch. "And yet tonight I stand taller than you." Lightning cracked, splitting the sky, its flash burning their faces into stark relief. Isabella on her knees, clutching her children, the beggar upright, weary but unbroken, and Victor, fists clenched, veins bulging, his empire balanced on the fragile edge of his command. Isabella's sobs filled the silence. "Victor, don't do this. Don't make me choose. You'll destroy us all." His voice thundered back. "I already told you, Isabella. By dawn they leave, or you do." The storm outside wailed, rattling the windows, as though the heavens themselves rebelled against the decree. And in that moment, the mansion ceased to be a home. It became a courtroom, with Victor as judge, Isabella as defendant, the beggar as witness, and two innocent children as the silent sentence that hung over them all. The hours until dawn stretched before them like a gallows. The clock struck midnight, its echo rolling through the mansion like a funeral bell. The storm outside still howled, but within those walls the storm had turned inward, clawing at hearts, gnawing at nerves, shredding what little trust remained. Victor sat rigid in his leather chair, his silhouette a statue of defiance, his eyes fixed on the flames in the fireplace as though daring them to burn hotter. The beggar stood near the archway, silent but unyielding, his body weary yet refusing to collapse. The twins had finally fallen asleep in their mother's trembling arms, their faces serene in a house drowning in war. Isabella rose slowly, placing the children on the velvet sofa, wrapping them in a shawl. She stood there, fragile yet fierce, her frame shaking but her eyes burning with a decision made. Her voice, hoarse but steady, sliced through the silence. "If it is truth you demand, Victor, then truth you will have. But when I speak, nothing in this house will remain the same." Victor's head turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Enough of riddles, speak plainly." She stepped closer, the firelight catching the streaks of silver in her hair, the tears that had dried on her cheeks. "You think you know everything, but you don't. You think these children are the only secret I carry, but you are wrong." The beggar stiffened. Victor's jaw clenched. The house seemed to lean in, listening. Isabella's hands trembled as she clutched her chest, her voice breaking yet resolute. "Years ago, before the empire, before the palaces, before the parties and the riches, there was a night I never spoke of, because to speak it would mean to destroy everything you and I built. But now, I see silence has only destroyed me." Her words fell heavy, like stones thrown into the depths of a lake. Victor's voice cracked with rage and unease. "What are you saying?" She turned, her eyes drifting toward the sleeping children, then back to him. "I am saying, these twins are not the only ones carrying a truth you cannot bear." The beggar's breath caught. He whispered, barely audible, "No, you wouldn't." But Isabella nodded slowly, her voice now shaking, breaking open every wound she had buried. "I kept a secret, Victor, about you, about the night that forged your empire, about the blood that was spilled, the deal that was struck, the soul that was sold, and tonight, it ends. You want me to choose? Then listen well, for I choose the truth." The storm outside screamed against the windows as if desperate to drown her words, but it was too late. She stepped closer to Victor, her finger trembling as she pointed at him. "You are not the man you claim to be, and when dawn comes your empire will no longer stand on wealth, but on ashes." Victor's eyes widened, a flicker of fear flashing for the first time. The beggar leaned forward, his face a mask of shock and horror. And in that midnight hour, Isabella shattered the silence with a confession that promised only one thing. The dawn would not bring peace, it would bring judgment. The fire crackled, but its warmth no longer touched the room. The mansion itself seemed to shiver under the weight of Isabella's words. Victor, usually a man of stone, now leaned forward, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What do you mean by this madness? Speak clearly, Isabella." But Isabella did not falter. For years she had bowed to his shadow, swallowed her doubts, buried her fears. Tonight, the dam had burst. Tonight, there would be no silence. Her voice grew colder, steadier, like a blade long hidden finally drawn. "Your empire was not built on brilliance, Victor. It was built on betrayal." The beggar shifted uneasily, his eyes darting between them, as though pieces of a puzzle he had long suspected were finally snapping into place. Isabella walked toward the grand piano in the corner, her fingers grazing its ivory keys, not to play, but as if each touch was peeling back a memory. "Do you remember the fire, Victor? The one in the old factory? The one they said was an accident?" Victor's face darkened. "That was decades ago. What does that—" "Don't you dare!" Isabella snapped, her voice suddenly sharp as glass. "Don't you dare pretend. I was there. I saw the smoke. I heard the screams. And I watched as you walked away, carrying contracts in your hands, knowing those men, those families, would never walk out alive." The room went still. The beggar's lips parted in disbelief. His whisper broke the silence. "My God!" It was true. Victor's chest rose and fell like a man drowning, anger fighting to smother guilt. You know nothing. You don't understand the price of survival." "I understand more than you think," Isabella cried. Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice only grew stronger. "I married you, Victor. I carried your burdens. But I will not carry your lies anymore." The beggar stepped forward now, his eyes blazing, his voice shaking with a rage that seemed to burn through years of silence. "That fire. My father was in that factory. My mother, too. Do you remember them, Victor? Do you remember the faces of those you left behind while you signed your blood-soaked deals?" Victor's eyes widened. His mouth opened, but no words came. The beggar's body trembled as he pointed a trembling finger toward Victor. "I have waited years for this day, years in the shadows, and tonight, your empire of ashes will answer for the lives it consumed." The twins stirred at the sound of his voice, whimpering softly in their sleep, as though even in their innocence they felt the weight of vengeance that filled the room. Victor rose now, towering, his voice shaking with fury. "You dare accuse me in my own house? You—" But Isabella cut him off with a single sentence, her voice low but devastating. "Victor, he is not just a beggar. He is the son of the family you destroyed." The words struck like a hammer. The beggar's eyes glistened with tears. Victor staggered back, his face pale as though the ground beneath him had cracked open. And in that moment, the walls of the mansion no longer echoed with wealth and power, but with a truth too heavy to bury, too sharp to escape. The silence in the room grew unbearable. The chandelier above swayed ever so slightly, its crystals scattering fractured light across faces twisted with grief, fury, and disbelief. Victor stood frozen, his power slipping through his fingers like sand, his empire reduced in this moment to a trembling heartbeat. The beggar stepped closer, each footfall echoing like a drumbeat of reckoning. His voice was no longer that of a broken man asking for bread. It was the voice of history itself, rising from the ashes. "For years," he began, his gaze fixed on Victor, "I wandered the streets with nothing but the stench of smoke in my lungs and the screams of the factory in my ears. I begged not for coins, but for justice. And tonight, Victor, you will hear what it sounds like when the forgotten demand to be remembered." Victor's jaw tightened, but the mask of arrogance he had worn his whole life was cracking. "You speak of the past as if it can be changed," he spat. "But the world rewards the strong. I did what I had to do." The beggar's eyes glistened with tears, but his voice remained firm. "No, Victor, you did what you wanted to do, and every coin in your pocket is heavy with the weight of bodies buried in unmarked graves." Isabella clutched the edge of the piano, her knuckles white. Her eyes darted to the twins, innocent, unaware of the storm that raged around them. She whispered, almost to herself, "And now those sins have found their way back, through your blood." Victor turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What are you saying?" The beggar's lips curled into a bitter smile, and with trembling hands, he pulled back the thin, worn blanket wrapped around the sleeping children. Their tiny faces glowed in the firelight, soft curls framing their cheeks, their breaths steady and pure. "These children," the beggar said, his voice thick with emotion, "are not orphans I stumbled upon. They are the last thread tying my family's bloodline to this world. Their mother died clutching their names on her lips, and I vowed, on her grave and on the ashes of my parents, that they would never know hunger, never know fire, never know abandonment, not while I breathed." Victor's face drained of color. He stumbled back a step, his eyes locked on the children as though the walls themselves were closing in. The beggar's voice thundered now, breaking years of silence. "They are yours, Victor, the children of your betrayal, conceived in shadows, abandoned in despair. Your blood runs through their veins." The words struck like lightning. Isabella gasped, clutching her chest. Victor staggered as though struck, his lips moving but no sound escaping. The beggar took another step forward, his face a mask of pain and fury. "I swore they would never bear the curse of your name, but tonight you will face them, you will face me, and you will face the ghosts you thought you buried in the flames." The twins stirred in their sleep, their small hands tightening into fists as if even in dreams they sensed the storm that had been unleashed. And for the first time in his life, Victor, the man who built empires, who commanded men, who silenced the world with wealth, stood utterly powerless before the truth he could no longer deny. The room seemed to shrink with every breath Victor took. The once mighty patriarch, the man whose name commanded respect in boardrooms and struck fear in enemies, now stood hunched, trembling, his crown of pride slipping into dust. His eyes darted between the beggar and the twins, as though trying to piece together fragments of a puzzle he had buried long ago. But the puzzle was whole now, and the picture it revealed was his own ruin. Victor's lips quivered. It cannot be." But his voice broke like glass, and even he no longer believed his own words. Isabella stepped forward, her gown brushing the marble, her presence steady as stone. She did not touch him, but her gaze cut deeper than any blade. "All this time," she whispered, "you built palaces on lies. You dined on guilt and called it triumph. And now, you dare pretend surprise when truth knocks at your door?" Victor's knees buckled. He reached for the grand chair beside him. The throne he always claimed was his rightful seat. But when his hand touched the gilded armrest, it felt cold, lifeless. His strength deserted him. The beggar's voice rose again, heavy with the weight of justice long delayed. "You burned my father's livelihood to the ground. You stole my mother's dignity when she begged you for mercy. You condemned my siblings to the streets, where hunger gnawed at their bones until only shadows remained. And yet you stand here draped in silk, as if your sins were washed clean by time." He took another step forward. "No, Victor. Time does not erase. It only sharpens." Victor clutched his chest, his breath uneven. His empire had survived rivals, scandals, even blood feuds. But this truth, was an enemy he could not buy, silence, or kill. The chandelier overhead rattled again, though no wind stirred. It was as if the house itself was rejecting him. Isabella spoke now, her voice trembling but clear. "I asked myself, Victor, why fate brought this man here tonight. Now I see. You may still hide behind your walls of gold, but heaven has no walls, and its justice has no locks." Victor's hand fell from the chair. He sank to the floor, the marble cold against his knees. It was the first time in decades he had bowed before anyone. The twins stirred, one whimpering softly. The beggar bent to soothe them, his touch tender, his love unshaken by the storm around him. And in that moment, the contrast could not have been sharper. One man who had lost everything but kept his soul, and another who had gained the world, but lost his soul entirely. The beggar's eyes locked on Victor's, piercing him. "You thought the fire consumed us, but it consumed you. You walk in ashes, Victor, whether you see it or not, and tonight, your throne is no more." Victor's head dropped, his shoulders caved, and with the weight of his sins pressing on him, he whispered, barely audible, "Forgive me." But forgiveness is not a word one plucks from the air. It is a word earned, a word tested, a word that may never be spoken to him again. The hall was silent except for Victor's labored breathing. His empire's weight pressed on him, yet for the first time, the gold, the silk, the power meant nothing. Every gaze in that grand room, once filled with admiration and envy, now turned cold and heavy. The beggar stood tall, though his clothes were torn, his hands rough, his frame weary from years of survival. But in that moment, he held more authority than the man who had commanded kingdoms of wealth. He lifted the twins gently into his arms and turned his eyes back to Victor. His words carried not rage but something sharper. truth wrapped in unshakable resolve. You think your crown is made of jewels, but no, Victor, it is made of bones. Every banquet you hosted was set upon the hunger of those you cast out. Every toast you raised dripped with the tears of those you betrayed. Victor closed his eyes, as if shutting out the voice could undo the reality tightening around his throat. But the beggar did not relent. His voice echoed against the marble walls. Tonight was meant to be a feast of triumph, but tonight it will be a feast of reckoning. The guests gasped as the beggar set the children down, walked slowly to the great banquet table, and placed both hands upon the polished oak. The platters gleamed with delicacies, roasted meats, wines aged in secret cellars, fruits carried across oceans. Yet beneath the sheen, something hollow stirred. The beggar raised his voice so that no one could ignore him. Let every dish here remind you of the mouths you denied bread. Let every glass of wine remind you of the thirst you ignored. Tonight, this feast will not celebrate Victor's legacy. It will bury it. He motioned to the servants, those same men and women who had worked years under Victor's iron rule. Slowly, hesitantly at first, they began lifting platters, pouring out wine and setting the food aside. Gasps filled the hall as luxury was stripped away dish by dish, as though the wealth itself was being undone before their eyes. Victor stumbled forward, his hand raised weakly. "Stop! Stop this madness!" His voice cracked, but the servants did not stop. Their eyes, once clouded with fear, now glimmered with a new fire, liberation. Isabella stepped closer to Victor. Her voice, steady and piercing, left no room for escape. "You called this night your victory, Victor. But tell me, what victory is left when those you ruled no longer fear you, when the very hands that built your throne now dismantle it before your eyes?" Victor fell silent. His power, once absolute, dissolved like salt in water. The beggar lifted his children once more, their small faces pressed against his chest. His voice dropped low, but it carried a weight heavier than any roar. "This is not vengeance, Victor. This is remembrance. You cannot undo the past, but tonight you will be forced to see it. Every stolen meal, every broken promise, every life you trampled. This feast will not feed your pride. It will feed your shame." The candles flickered violently, as though the very air shuddered under the weight of truth. Victor collapsed onto the floor, not from force, but from a collapse within, a man watching the walls of his empire crumble, stone by stone, from the inside out. Victor knelt upon the cold marble floor, his body trembling, his voice stripped of command. The man who once spoke with thunder now sounded like a fading echo. "Please," his words crawled into the silence, "spare me, for the sake of what I once was." The hall remained still. The guests who had once cheered his name now stared, their expressions unreadable, as though they too were deciding whether the man before them was worth saving. The beggar held his children tightly, their fragile innocence shielding him from the venom of vengeance. His eyes lingered on Victor, not with hatred, but with a depth that pierced beyond flesh, into the marrow of the man's soul. "Spare you?" the beggar repeated slowly, each syllable deliberate. "You who never spared the weak, the hungry, the forgotten? Tell me, Victor, why should the hand you crushed now extend mercy to you?" Victor's lips quivered. His voice broke into fragments. "I was blind, drunk with power. I thought wealth made me untouchable. I see now. I see." The beggar stepped closer, his shadow falling over Victor's broken frame. His tone, though heavy, carried a strange stillness, as though he were weighing a burden greater than vengeance itself. "There is no undoing what has been done. No coin can buy back a life wasted. No crown can silence the cries of the past. But mercy—" His voice trailed, the word trembling in the air like a blade caught between striking and falling. "Mercy is not mine to give. It is earned only in what comes next. The guests leaned in, breathless. Isabella's gaze flicked from the beggar to Victor, her heart torn between justice and compassion. The beggar lifted his son's tiny hand and placed it upon Victor's shoulder. The boy, too young to understand the weight of the moment, simply looked at the fallen man with wide, unclouded eyes. "Here is mercy, Victor," the beggar whispered. "Not from me, not from those you wronged, but from the future you thought you could control. The children you ignored, mocked, and discarded, these are the voices that decide whether you rise or remain broken." Victor shuddered, the touch of the child searing through his chest like fire and ice. For the first time in his life he wept, not the proud, controlled tears of a man preserving dignity, but the raw, desperate sobs of a man stripped bare before truth. The beggar turned away, his children cradled close. His voice lingered behind him, steady and unshaken. "Your wealth will rot. Your halls will stand empty. But if you wish to be remembered for more than ruin, Victor, then prove it. Not with words, not with gold, but with the years you have left. Let your deeds bear witness, or let your silence bury you." The hall remained still. The reckoning had been spoken, and Victor, for the first time, had no command left, only a choice. Victor's face filled the frame. Sweat clung to his temples, streaks of tears cutting through the dust on his skin. His lips trembled as he tried to form words, but nothing steady would come. His once commanding jaw now quivered like that of a frightened child. A single tear dropped, splashing onto the marble floor. The sound, though faint, seemed louder than thunder in the silent hall. The beggar's eyes locked onto Victor's. The camera lingered on them, dark, weary eyes that had seen both cruelty and grace. They narrowed, not in anger, but in the piercing weight of truth. Then the close-up shifted, his small child's hand, tiny fingers pressing against Victor's shoulder. The camera caught the contrast, the fragile hand of innocence against the broad shoulder of a man who had once crushed thousands under his empire. Victor's breath hitched, his nostrils flared. The camera zoomed closer to his eyes, now red, glistening, filled with the horror of his own reflection. I was wrong," he whispered, barely audible, his lips trembling with the confession. The beggar leaned closer, his face inches from Victor's. His voice dropped low, steady, cutting through the air like steel wrapped in calm. "You don't need to tell me. Tell them." The camera turned slightly, framing the two men with the twins in between. One child blinked curiously, tilting his head, while the other reached out, brushing Victor's cheek with a soft, innocent touch. Victor's face broke. His sobs spilled over. His forehead pressed to the marble as his body shook. The lens held on his shaking hands, clenched against the cold floor, once tools of power, now symbols of helplessness. The beggar turning his face to the side, his jaw tight, his eyes unblinking. His whisper, heavy as stone, slipped into the silence. "Let your hands build, not destroy. Let your tears water the ground you once scorched. That is your only redemption."